Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and today our guest is Professor Susan Stokes. She is the John S. Saden Professor of Political Science and Director of the Yale Program on Democracy. Professor Stokes' research interests include democratic theory and how democracy functions in developing societies, with a focus on Latin America. Her most recent book is Democracy and the Culture of Skepticism: Political Trust in Argentina and Mexico. Today we will talk with Professor Stokes about why leftist parties in Latin American countries have recently won so much electoral support. Welcome, Professor Stokes.
Thank you very much.
You recently completed a paper on globalization and the left in Latin America. Please give us an overview and tell us some of your findings.
Well, there are two notable things that have happened recently in Latin America. One is that there's been a big shift toward what's often called neoliberalism, meaning open markets, relatively open trade with the rest of the world, integration with capital markets. That's sort of on the economic side. And then on the political side, especially very recently, there have been victories by parties of the electoral left, social democratic parties, sometimes more left-wing parties. And my paper basically sort of puts those two facts together. It shows that the electoral success of the left is largely due, or is significantly due, to parties of the right coming to power and opening trade and decreasing spending and increasing capital market integration. And those changes tend to help the left at the ballot box in the next election.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the research for the paper. I know you look at many different countries. Can you give us a little overview on the research that you've done?
Well, actually, my interest in a way in some of these same issues goes back to my dissertation, which I did in Peru a long time ago. In the 1980s, I was interested in the fact that a left-wing coalition had won elections at the municipal level in Lima, which is a very big, important city. So I've actually been interested in electoral politics and the left and ideology for a long time. The current research project really involved just sort of keeping tabs on what's been going on. I didn't actually spend enormous amount of time flying around the region talking to leaders. It's a large statistical cross-national study informed by my own expertise in Latin America, which I've been studying ever since I finished graduate school or was in graduate school.
Okay, so in the countries you've looked at, what is the effect of globalization and state size on elections in those Latin American countries?
Well, it tends to help the left in elections, especially when rightist parties or right-leaning parties come into office and open up capital markets, open up markets to goods and services, and decrease the size of the state, that is, have less government spending. That tends to help the left on average in the next election. You can see a little bit of the same pattern maybe happening in the United States in our recent electoral cycle, where a big issue on the Democratic side was NAFTA and free trade and redistributive policies that tended to concentrate wealth. That probably helped the Democrats, and similar kind of thing has been true in Latin American elections.
Okay, so what is the effect of the left in power on globalization and on spending?
Well, that's the other side of the story. So part of the story is what happens in elections when these economic changes happen. And then the second part of the story is what happens to the economic changes when the left comes to power. And there the interesting story is that even though the left has benefited electorally from opening of trade and capital markets under right-wing administrations, it doesn't then, once in office, reduce globalization, reduce the exposure of the country to international markets. Rather, it compensates for that exposure by increasing spending. My own research indicates that the left in office increases general social spending, and then there are other studies that suggest that particularly spending on health and human capital, education, increase under the left in the region.
One of the things you touch on in your paper is an anti-bias towards trade for some of the candidates. Can you expound upon that a bit?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing. they've been careful not to promise to, cut free trade agreements or to increase protectionist tariffs. They're not, the candidates in electoral campaigns, especially the left-leaning candidates, don't go out of their way to make those kinds of promises, but they do, in more couched language, suggest that they'll revise aspects of the North American Free Trade Agreement, for example, and especially in the Mexican case. Again, very much like the Obama-Clinton debate during the campaign here. It's a matter of sort of suggesting that globalization is not entirely good especially for their constituents. But then once in office, I think there are cross-cutting pressures that tend to discourage these left-of-center presidents now from really closing down on trade. It would hurt some others of their constituents. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what the effects of those policies would be. So instead of doing that, they try to increase spending as a way of sort of compensating those who are maybe the losers or who experience more volatility when globalization advances.
Mm-hmm. In doing the research, was there anything that particularly surprised you?
I think that what surprised me was the degree to which the Latin American cases were actually similar to cases that we know in the advanced industrial countries. Mm-hmm. So I went into the project believing the notion that had been put out there by other scholars that there was a dramatic kind of exceptionalism going on in Latin America. The general finding in the advanced democracies has been that the more open a country is to trade, on average, the larger the public sector will be. And again, the rationale is that you need a large public sector to cushion the effects of globalization. It looked for a long time, especially going back to the 1990s, as though the Latin American countries were going in the opposite direction. They were increasing trade and at the same time cutting, very drastically sometimes, cutting the state, cutting the public sector. The more I looked into it, the more it looked like it's sort of a story that's not all that unlike what happens in European democracies, perhaps in the United States and other advanced democracies, wealthier countries, where you get an increase in trade that leads to an increase of social spending in general, government spending, but only under the conditions that a left-of-center, social democratic kind of government comes to power. But those conditions do tend to make it more likely that such a government will come to power. So really the story doesn't look so different from the one that we're more familiar with in the advanced democracies. The difference being that the state sector probably doesn't function as well in Latin America as an insurance policy against volatility or as a redistributor of resources from the losers from trade to from the winners to trade to the losers, I should say.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for being with us today and sharing some of your research.
Thank you very much.
For more information about Professor Stokes and her research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.